Hi, everybody. This is Politics by Jake. This is the Saturday show, and welcome to it. And let's get right into it. Let's talk about some of the things that have been going on. Of course, we had the incredibly astonishing, unbelievable ridiculosity of the State of the Union speech. You know, because we've all heard the analysis by now. We've heard the fact-checking. We've heard the applause lines. We've heard the horse race. We've heard the polling spin. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is upstream analysis, upstream commentary. That's what we talk about here. It's something deeper, something more dangerous, something that most commentators either can't see or are afraid to say, because what we witnessed was not just a speech. It was a ritual. It was a display of power, of grievance, of grift, of sales talk, of con man, of submission, and of psychological fusion between a wounded leader and wounded followers. And if you're analyzing it as policy, you're already missing it. If you're analyzing it as messaging, you're already behind. What we're dealing with now is something that has crossed from politics into mythology, and in some cases, pathology. And unless we understand that, unless we name it clearly, we are going to misunderstand what is happening in this country. So let's talk about it honestly, shall we? Let's talk about the narcissistic symbiosis. Let's talk about the sociopathy. Let's talk about the cultic elements that have attached themselves to political power, because this is no longer just about tariffs or NATO or budget lines. This is about a mass psychological phenomenon that is reshaping the republic. So we just had Donald Trump, being up there for an hour and 47 minutes, they say, in that bombastic, that absurd, that ridiculous State of the Union address that many stations, I think, they would rather not carry it. They were forced to carry it because, Donald Trump threatened them in one way or the other. And this is the thing about Donald Trump, which I don't understand, because I've told you before, I think he's a doofus. And I think he's being used. This is a person who sleeps at cabinet meetings, but people are afraid of him. Michael Wolff talked just recently about how he was up there being his fabulous self, and he didn't understand how anyone in the country could feel like what he was saying was true, when there's so much evidence to the contrary that's coming out every day that it's false. And the dismay that the populace feels with the people in Congress, all the Republicans who absurdly applauded and hooted and called out, if you listened to it, you heard it, and it was just absurd. It was pathetic. And I looked at that and I thought, maybe it is that they're so desperate because they know how bad it is, and they know what great danger they're in for 2026 when November comes around, that maybe they had a meeting before going in and they all resolved that everybody in there was just going to hoot and holler and clap, and they're going to do, and they were going to do everything they could to hold on to their entitlement and portray this to the best way, in their opinion, even if they don't believe it, to hold on to their entitlement, their congressional entitlement, their prestige as Congress representatives, their great health care policy that they get is much better than ours, their pay, their prerogative, and the sense that they are meaningful, that they are elevated above their fellows, and that they're playing, the good game and not the bad, corrupt game. They're fighting the good fight. so on and so forth. So we've talked on this show before about how there's, and I referred to it as the Jungian thing, but it's sociopathy. In other words, talking about many people in this country who are flocking. This is horrible. To become Ice Gestapo, as I call them. The brown shirts, the squadristi, which is, that's an Italian word. In Italy, in the 20th century, there was a counterpart to the Gestapo, and they were called the black shirts, actually. And they were called the squadristi. And they did. They wore black shirts. And then there's the 20th century variant of this, what was called, the Germans themselves called it, the Sturmabteilung, which means the storm detail, the stormtroopers. Sturmabteilung is German for storm detail of Ernst Röhm. They were bully boys, and they were just like Ice Gestapo. They wanted to go out on the streets, and they wanted to wreak havoc. They wanted to hurt their fellow man. They wanted to commit mayhem. And I talked about how this is being done under the cover of law. And I'm talking about the Sturmabteilung. A lot of times they were fighting the socialists, but they were bully boys. They were fighting in the streets. That's what they loved to do. That's what they were doing all the time. They were fighting in the streets. And just like those Sturmabteilung of the 20th century, you have these Ice Gestapo of today. They want to wreak havoc. They want to hurt their fellow man. Like I said, they want to commit mayhem. And I talked about how this is being done under cover of law. And I made the distinction that it's not under color of law, because, look, they're committing depredations. They're committing essentially atrocities. They're putting people in what you can only call concentration camps, and they're building them all the time, and they're doing these things, and they're doing it under cover of law. And why? They're doing it to protect them in their maladaptation. But the greater thing is their incredible desire, which is, amazing to me. This incredible urgency that they have to go out and hurt people. They long to do that. When they shot Alex Pettit, they shot him 10 times. He was surrounded by like 5 officers, you'll excuse the expression, 5 ICE Gestapo, and there was like a dog also. And he went down, and they plugged him. They shot him. They didn't shoot him once or twice or 3 times. They shot him 10 times. 10 times. And at this point, I think this is a convenient point to take a break. We're going to talk more about this. And this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. All right, and this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. And we've been talking about the depredations. And, one thing that I wanted to tell you is that Politics by Jake does upstream analysis and commentary. We don't generally catalog stuff that's going on. I highly recommend you to Keith Olbermann, who does a podcast. You can get it on Podbean and iHeart. It's an iHeart production. You can basically get it anywhere. He tends to catalog these things more. I highly also recommend that you go to alternative media, like social media, like Instagram and so on and so forth. You'll get people who are willing to catalog all the depredations that are going on. I do some of that if it relates to the upstream commentary and analysis that I'm doing, but I don't generally do that because that's not what the show is about. I say this periodically so that my new listeners who are coming on can understand that that's what I do, and to recommend you to other sources. Keith is a colleague, and he's an excellent source, and you can check him out, and you'll get a lot of information from him. But bear with me now, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, I'm going to show you how it is worse. It's even worse. Now, we were talking about what I call flippantly, but not incorrectly, the Jungian thing. And I call it the Jungian thing because I want my listeners and viewers to understand that this is something that Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, talked about. And it's basically, you've got the wounded hero, someone who's full of grievance, and I'm reluctant to call a hero, but let's say in the eyes of the people who respond to him, he's a hero. He's someone who's full of grievance. And what does Trump always say? It's so unfair. I've been treated so unfairly. I mean, it's spot on. Full of retribution, and all the things, all the things that Christianity tells you not to do, by the way. And this enters into what's called a narcissistic symbiosis. And this is basically just what I told you. A narcissistic symbiosis is a mutually reinforcing psychological relationship between two parties, often a leader, and then followers, where each feeds the other's ego, their insecurity and grandiosity. So, in other words, in plain terms, the leader needs admiration. The leader needs validation. The leader needs devotion. The followers need someone onto whom they can project strength, grievance, and destiny for the things that they feel have gone wrong in their own lives. And each one completes the other's psychological deficit. This is not healthy interdependence. What it is it's a closed loop of ego maintenance. The leader feels omnipotent because, and once again, think about who this reminds you of. The leader feels omnipotent because the followers reflect it back. The followers feel empowered because they feel heard, maybe for the first time in their lives, and they fuse their identity to the leader. Individually, they're unstable. Collectively, they're amplified. And so in mass politics, it becomes dangerous because criticism of the leader feels like an attack on the self of the follower. And when this happens, rational discourse, like what we're trying to have here on Politics by Jake, where we explain these things to you, it collapses. So bear that in mind, because we're going to continue on about this and show you just how far down this particular rabbit hole goes, okay? So each one really looking at itself, the broken souls out there in the population, the broken soul of the charismatic leader, and so forth, okay? So, narcissistic symbiosis. I'm taking the time to explain this because this is really important for my listeners, and I know I have new listeners all the time, and welcome to the show, by the way. But this is really important for you to understand this paradigm, because this is a thing, and this is what's happening with Trump and his followers. And like I said, I'm about to explain to you just how far the rabbit hole goes down. Each one imagines that they can cultivate their own egos through this stuff. And what you get out of this is this vicarious living by the masses and the seemingly invulnerable dictatorial aura around the boss. And what does this yield? It's collective insanity. It's mass psychosis. The folie à millions. And if you like, and I've talked about her before, take a look at Bandy Lee writings about this. I think it's worldmentalhealth.org. And then Bandy Lee also. But something else is happening. Part of this, part of what has grown up out of that terrain is what I would call the MAGA mythology. Now, follow me. The MAGA mythology is a mystery religion. You saw it in around 2020. It's a religion, right? And so was the mass psychosis. You might say that was a religion also. The story is, this is the story. There's a global or a globalist billionaire elite. And remember, the best lies are the ones that have elements of truth in them. So there's a global, and I'm not denying at all, just for the sake of this, making this argument to explain to you how these people are. I'm not denying that there is a billionaire globalist elite. There is. But they are cannibals. They are vampires. Now follow me, please. They are pedophiles. They are ghouls. And they tend to run the world in this mythos. And the only power that is fighting back against them, according to this mythology, this MAGA mythology, is Trump. So Trump is fighting these powers and principalities with all their perversions. And like I said, this takes right from the scriptures, and they borrow from and they co-opt scripture, biblical scripture. I realize that some of my listeners, don't necessarily believe in the Bible as scripture, but in Ephesians 6:12, Paul says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." This is the thing. And Trump is fighting these powers. He's not in bed with them, which I can tell you he most certainly is. One of the great lies that the credulous, the easily led, some might call it suckers, and a lot of maggots fall into this category, is that somehow their interests and the interests of billionaires align, and they're somehow magically the same. This could not be further from the truth. It could not be further from the truth. And at this point, let's take a break, shall we? And we'll be back. And this is Politics by Jake. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. right, and this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. And we're talking about some crazy stuff here, and I realize that it's crazy, but we're in a very serious situation. For those of you who've been listening to the show before, I told you at the beginning of 2026, and I warned you in 2025, but at the beginning of 2026, when 2026 happened, back in January, I said, welcome to 2026, welcome to the show, welcome to the fight, because this is going to be a fight. And I'm trying to explain to you what the underlying pathology is here. And I think it's appropriate to call it a pathology. I really do. This is a sickness. This is a cult. And it needs to be sussed out in order to, and it may not be possible to do that because, as I explained to you earlier in the show, at a point where there's this fusion between the wounded leader and the wounded followers, it's a collective psychosis, and rational discourse can tend to collapse. So those people, they are not going to be available, and they're going to be against you. But we have to, continue the fight. We just have to continue on. There's really nothing else to do. So with that said, let's go on and let's explain more of this. And I realize we're really going down the rabbit hole today. I realize that. I thank you for listening. Thank you for joining the fight. Thank you for being here on the show with me to go through this. And I hope you'll stay with me through 2026 when we fight to the end of this. So when we last tuned in, sorry to put it that way because it really does sound like an old radio drama, Trump is fighting these powers, right? And mind you, this is in the mythos. This is in the mythology of the MAGA cult and what they're doing. And this is the Pizzagate doctrine. Remember the Pizzagate? Pizzagate, the Washington, D.C. pizzeria, and that there's something horrible going on in the basement of the pizzeria, and there's no basement in the pizzeria. And even though this was proven, it has had several iterations. It comes back. It's like a bad penny. It comes back, and somebody actually went in there with a gun and I think shot somebody. But there's no basis to it. It's absolute myth. It's absolute fantasy. But Trump is the only fighter, and he's like a Christ figure or a prophet. He's the only Christ figure. They would say, they have said, who is fighting the pedophile, ghoul, cannibal elite. And this is, what it is. So it all, in their minds, depends on Trump. And they're, of course, pedophiles are running the world into the ground, destroying the world, destroying the U.S., and there's an elite conspiracy against Trump. And it's pedophile ghouls. See how convenient this is? But what's Trump saying now? He's saying there's nothing more to see. Not all of the Epstein files have been released. Just the stuff that exonerates him, because the stuff that was released has not implicated them, although he's been, allegations are that he's mentioned like 1 million times in the Epstein files. And even Congress representatives have been shown the unredacted versions, and they're not releasing them. And so he's saying, okay, I released them, so he's controlling the narrative again, you see? And this is very powerful. This is very difficult. The President of the United States controls the bully pulpit. It's powerful. I'm not going to deny it's powerful. When Spanberger, the new governor of Virginia, who the Democrats identify, and they usually do this in the State of the Union speech, usually they have someone give the rebuttal, the Democrats, who they think is a rising star. Abigail Spanberger recently won the governorship of the state of Virginia. I don't know that makes her a rising star. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, that's who they chose. But she's not before the assembled Congress. And she's just kind of like a lone voice crying in the wilderness. And I'm concerned about that. But so Trump has the bully pulpit. This is unfortunate. And he's trying to fight. And once again, I hasten to add, according to the mythology, according to the mythos of all this, he's trying to fight and to present the papers for being shown, the exhibits, the documents, the 6 million documents, and the 2,000 or 3,000 photographs, and the 2,000 or 3,000 tapes. Remember, the thing that penetrated into the mind of that auto worker when Trump was visiting the auto plant, it was a pedophile protector. That's what registers. Not austerity demon, not wrecker of alliances, not destroyer of the economy. And by the way, that's happening. And I don't think we're going to be doing a show on that today or a segment on that today, but that's happening. And it's proceeding apace, which means it's absolutely proceeding not only on schedule, but it's proceeding very quickly. It's happening very quickly. So not an austerity demon, not a wrecker of alliances. See, that's the economy. That's too abstract for an auto worker. But see, the pedophile protector. In other words, the basis of this whole thing is a religion where you've got the evil, the globalist, the pedophiles, the ghouls, actual ghouls, perverts, vampires, it's another fictional creature, and so forth. Cannibals, you've got them. And the only person fighting them is Trump. And the reason why I bring this up is because that's a world outlook. And a world outlook, that's more than an issue. That's more than just, it's more than just, the tariffs. Or even the NATO. And even wrecking the alliances. And even Greenland. And even Kattegat. And even the economy. And stuff like that. And it shouldn't be this way. Obviously. But it is. So that's where we are. So the idea is now it's a crisis of faith. And you could say, the Trump base are pagans. And I hasten to add here, I was talking to somebody about this, and they said, you call them pagans, that's pejorative, that's derogatory language. A pagan was actually a reference. I agree. It could be construed in a secondary or a tertiary definition as something like that. But pagan is basically a Catholic term. It's for a non-Catholic. And they've been recruited to the pagan cult of the state. I'm not going to keep using it. As Pius XI once put it vis-a-vis Mussolini. So like I said, Catholic. Pius XI was the Pope during the time of Mussolini. The pagan cult of the state, he said, and the cruelty inherent in that. And they are, of course, apostates. And Trump says, I've never done, an apostate is someone who's turned against the Christian religion. And Trump says, I've never done anything that I would need to ask forgiveness for. And I don't go to confession or anything. And he said, I don't even really go to communion. And he said, it's just, they just give you a saltine or something like that. That's all it is. So, unleavened bread. That's the whole idea. So apostasy, which is when you go from Christianity to something else, like Julian the Apostate. And at this point, let's take another break, and we will be back to talk more about pagans and apostasy and communion and saltines. And this is Politics by Jake, and we'll be back. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. All right, this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. Thank you very much. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the fight. Welcome to almost March of 2026. So, we're talking about apostasy when you go from Christianity to something else, like Julian the Apostate, and it's been done before, this isn't new. And then you have the heretics. In other words, the idea of health and wealth, the theology of God will bless you, and it will make you rich, and it will make you healthy, and so on and so forth. And this is the way a lot of people, and it's fear. They do it out of fear. It's that you pay your tithing, God will bless you. And a lot of people pay their tithing and they don't get blessed with the wealth. See, they're after the wealth. That's what even the ones who are the poor and who are the middle class, they're after that increase. And they may not get it. They may get it in another way, but that's really the underlying thing. That is rampant in Christianity, apostate Christianity, I might add. The theology of God will make you rich. And, if it makes you healthy, that's good too. So Christianity becomes very transactional in this way. And you can really understand it. I understand it. I understand why certain people are like that. But the point that I'm making here is it's beyond political. It's eschatology. And eschatology, by the way, is a branch of theology that deals with the last things. It comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means the last or the final thing. And in religious terms, it refers to doctrines about, the end of the world, the final judgment, heaven and hell, the destiny of humanity, the ultimate culmination of history. In Christianity, for example, eschatology includes ideas about the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment. And more broadly, it can mean a worldview that frames current events as parts of an ultimate cosmic showdown. In other words, a narrative in which history is rushing towards a decisive apocalyptic climax. And when politics becomes eschatological, it stops being about policy and it starts being about salvation, damnation, destiny, and the ultimate good versus ultimate evil. And this is what I'm trying to point out to you here, kind of as an undercurrent in the show. That's a very different psychological register. And that's basically what eschatology is. And there's a crisis of the faith. Now, you may, and I understand, and I appreciate, you may think I'm really exaggerating when I talk in these terms. You may say, Jake has gone crazy again. He's talking about wild, whirling things. And I go from the ideas of pure politics, that these are political people. And then I talk about the more sociopathic of them who are still aligned with them. ICE, who I call alternatively ICE Gestapo, And I'm referring, when I say that, the 20th century variants of these, because these have occurred before. These called alternatively the squadristi, who were the Italian black shirts, the Sturmabteilung, or storm detail of Ernst Röhm, the brown shirts. They wore brown shirts. And also, of course, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, the actual Nazi Gestapo. And you may think, like I said, I'm getting a bit excessive about this. You may think that. But I want to tell you that I'm not. And I'm going to explain to you why this kind of concern is absolutely, positively warranted. And I commend you, by the way, to do your own research about this. As I've always said, that's the great thing about the internet. I was talking with a colleague the other day, and he was getting to the point. He's a lawyer, and he was talking about getting to the point of ultimate facts. And I said, look, first of all, this isn't a court of law. Second of all, you may not get ultimate facts on something for years or decades, but you have the internet, you have your reason, and some of the things that I talk about, you can go and look it up yourself and see if Jake is right or not. Now, Dan Rather used to talk about the old reporter standard, and he used to say, and he was referring when he was talking about the death of John F. Kennedy. And he said, if I talk to two people or three people and they both say that somebody's been shot, and then he posed the question, he says, what do I know? He says, I know the president has been shot. And it's like this. You can reason like this. It's okay. This is how reporters are taught to reason when they do stories. And I think because this is the voice of warning to you, I'm not afraid to raise it. I'm not lying to you. I'm not saying this for my own benefit, because I've said before, as I've said before periodically on the show, we are in terrible trouble. We are in the hands of a bunch of fascists and a bunch of autocrats who have given over their own lives to this doofus, because he is, of a man, Donald Trump. And I'll tell you where I'm going with this. In Washington, D.C., right now, it's happening right now. And this is bigger than Donald Trump, as I have said. Donald Trump is a man of very incredibly ordinary intelligence. He's being used by a cabal that is more dangerous even than he is. And you can go to Washington right now and go to Google Earth and go and, for example, go to the Department of Justice. Look at the front of the building. And what you'll see there is a giant banner that pictures a pugnacious, determined image of Donald Trump. And it's draped over the entrance to the Department of Justice. And I wish I could tell you, I hate to have to tell you this, but this is not the only place where this is happening. You know that he destroyed the East Wing of the White House, which is a historical icon. It literally can't happen legally without the consent of Congress. But the Republicans in Congress love to have it so. And they support him in all these things. They have colluded with him, and there's more. I'm about to tell you more. They colluded with him by their silence in the destruction of a historical icon of the United States of America. Folks, listeners, viewers, he literally destroyed a part of the White House for his own benefit. And in his place, he put some grand ballroom. And he had a hedonistic party in there just as soon as he could get it up and running. Another thing he wants to do is he wants to build a triumphal arch. And he wants to do all this stuff using your money. He says, oh, it's all going to be private donors. But don't believe him. This is the usual Trump con. He wants to use your money, the money of the Treasury, the money of the sovereign people of the United States to do this because he laughs at you inwardly. Because he thinks you're, and he's not the only one, but he gives permission to the others. Kash Patel is one. I'm not going to get to him today, but Kash Patel is one. But there are many. They laugh at you because they think that you're suckers. Period. He thinks you are marks. He thinks that you are people to be taken. And like I said, there are similar ones. The Department of Justice is not the only one. There's one at the Department of Labor. And how laughable is this for an oligarch like Trump to masquerade and say that he believes in labor and to put his image on the Department of Labor? What an abomination! What callous mockery! What solemn mockery to appropriate the labor movement unto himself. And there's one at the Department of Agriculture. And there, like I say, there are several of these. So he's basically taking these departments of the government. And remember, he was talking about, well, not the Senate, but the House. And he basically said, knowing, of course, that there's already a Speaker of the House, that lickspittle, MAGA Mike Johnson, and he said, actually, I'm both the President and the Speaker of the House. And this is the madness of the man. This is the delusion of the man. This is what you heard if you listened to that hour and 47 minutes a couple of days ago. And obviously we're doing the show on the weekend, and this is what you're seeing is a very aggressive subsumption, or subsuming, if you prefer, of the United States of America to the cult of Donald Trump. But it is happening. And it is proceeding apace. And when the image of a political leader eclipses the institutional identity of the department itself, you are witnessing symbolic subsumption. The Constitution recedes, the person advances. And this is Politics by Jake, and we'll be back. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. All right, this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. And let's shift gears here for a minute. And there's a lot to talk about, but one of the things that you may think that I'm exaggerating when I say what I'm about to say, that what we're actually living in is not capitalism, but I'm not really exaggerating. And the reason I'm not exaggerating is because I remember, and some of you listening remember, what actual capitalist ownership looked like. There was a time when the owner of a business took pride in it. The shop was clean. The asphalt was smooth. The uniforms were pressed. The employees carried themselves with discipline because the owner instilled it. And you used to have advertisements in the 1950s, like the gas stations. This beautiful, shining, gleaming gas station. The one I remember was Sunoco. I don't even know if Sunoco exists anymore. But it was not cruelty, but it was pride, because the place reflected the man. It reflected investment. It reflected stewardship. It reflected accountability. The owner lived in the same town. His name was on the building. If something went wrong, you knew where to find him. That was bourgeois capitalism. Now contrast that with what we have. You don't have owners anymore. You have extraction managers. You have asset strip specialists. You have private equity firms that buy a company, they load it with debt, sell the land, cut the pensions, fire the workers, and then they blame market conditions. This is just like what I talk about with the 60,000 factories and other businesses that were taken whole cloth, some were split down like I described, and they're split in their constituent parts and sold to our economic enemies. And that's globalization. And that destroyed many, many people. Because not only did it take away those industries where those people had their jobs, here in the United States, here in, small town or middle town America, but also the collateral industries, the companies that had grown up to service those industries, to service those factories, and to service the people who worked there, the schools, the grocery stores, the supermarkets, the hardware stores, and the department stores, and so on and so forth. Now you have corporations, they're headquartered, nowhere, loyal to no community, accountable to no citizenry. That is not capitalism. That's oligarchy, folks. And it is ruthless. It is predatory. And it's extractive. And it masquerades as capitalism. That's the trick. Younger Americans, those who have grown up entirely inside globalization, believe this is what capitalism is. Remember, I'm dating this back to about 1989, 1990. Capitalism implies ownership, okay? It implies risk. Capitalists take risks. Oligarchs do not like risk at all. They don't want to have anything to do with it. Capitalism implies ownership. Ownership implies responsibility, and responsibility implies continuity. But that's not what we have here. And like I say, those of you who have come up from like about 1989, or maybe a little earlier, that when you were too early to remember, you were too young to remember or acknowledge what's happening, you have not, this is my contention, you have not lived in an actual capitalist society. What you're witnessing and what is masquerading as capitalism is actually liquidation. It's quarterly plunder. It is financialization, masquerading as production. The national bourgeoisie, which is the landed class, the business owners, has been replaced by transnational managerial elites. Factories close, communities hollow out, and executives receive bonus for efficiency gains. Efficiency. That's what they call it when they remove dignity from labor. And then they wrap themselves in the American flag, and they say they believe in free markets. Well, let me tell you something. Free markets require dispersed power. Oligarchy concentrates it. Free markets, they require risk, as I said, to be borne by owners. Oligarchy socializes losses, privatizes gains. So what we have is quarterly plunder. What we have is financialization masquerading as production. We have a national bourgeoisie that has been replaced by transnational managerial elites. Factories close, communities hollow out, and the executives receive bonuses for efficiency gains. Efficiency. That's what they call it when they remove dignity from labor. And then they wrap themselves in the American flag and say they believe in free markets. Free markets require dispersed power. Oligarchy concentrates it. Instead of 20 convenience stores, you only have one or two. Instead of 50 department stores, you have like one or two. Do you understand? That's oligarchy. Oligarchy socializes losses. Free markets require risk. I told you oligarchs they can't stand risk. Oligarchy socializes losses, privatizes gains. Free markets create pride and enterprise. Oligarchy creates spreadsheet extraction. And this is the distinction that has to be understood. Because as I said, if you believe that you're living under oligarchy, then you begin asking different questions. If you think you're living under capitalism, what you wind up is defending your own exploitation. You begin asking, who owns this? Who benefits? Who bears the risk? Who is accountable? And once you start asking those questions, the mythology begins to crack. This is not anti-capitalism. This is anti-predation. This is an indictment, not of ownership, but of its corruption. And if we don't teach younger Americans the difference, they will never know what was taken from them. And this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. If you think owning things in your own name keeps you in control, think again. In today's world, lawsuits, taxes, and predators are everywhere. That's why the smart money hides in plain sight. We help you to build legal firewalls, LLCs, land trusts, private contracts that protect your assets while keeping you invisible. Call Twain Consulting today at 310-997-2204. Find us on Facebook at Twain Consulting. That's facebook.com/Twain Consulting. Protect what you've built before someone else takes it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Okay, and this is Politics by Jake. And just a note before the show ends. Of course, J.D. Vance has come out and is now the president's, excuse me, pardon me, I'm sorry. I met Donald Trump, the current tenant of the White House, his right-hand man to extensively resolve Medicaid fraud. And there's this accusation. And Trump in his State of the Union address said, words to the effect, we have all seen the documents, Somali immigrants, terrible fraud, and I've got the goods on them, and we have the documents. And he's referring to the Somalis. Like I say, there's a population of Somali population in the state of Minnesota. And supposedly they have been promoting or they have been stealing Medicaid funds. Now, let me just say, just as a closing capper on the show, there's nothing objectionable, nothing at all, nothing that could be said objectionable about seeing that federal state funds for social programs are properly administered. There could never be anything wrong with that. But this isn't the way to go about it. If there is a fraud, there are already instrumentalities within the system to detect that, and they know that, to ferret it out, to stop it from happening. This dramatic announcement in the State of the Union address, and he's got it in for the state of Minnesota, he's got it in for Governor Walz, who ran against him as vice president, and he's definitely got it in for the Somalis, is just more. And honestly, it's more of this diseased and distracted mind concocting chimeras that he can resolve with this grandiose problem. And this is Politics by Jake, and we'll see you the next time.